Every few months, the world hears the same promise. Peace talks are underway. Leaders gather in grand halls, cameras flash, and headlines promise hope. The world dares to believe, but then, nothing changes. Bombs keep falling, cities keep burning, families keep fleeing, and the headlines, they vanish just as quickly as they appeared. Why is peace always so close, yet always so far away? Why do nations, mediators, and international organizations try again and again, only for negotiations to collapse? This isn't just a story about war. It's a story about the mechanisms of power, the interplay of politics and strategy, and the hidden forces that make peace seem nearly impossible. This is the story of why peace talks fail every time. Before we begin, if you want to understand the forces that shape global conflicts, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. Knowledge is the first step toward understanding and change. A quick disclaimer: this documentary is based entirely on verified facts and credible sources for educational purposes. It doesn't support violence or favor any side. All analysis is based on publicly available research and historical records. So, what exactly are peace talks? On paper, they seem simple. Two sides meet, exchange proposals, and sign a deal to end the fighting. But, as history shows us time and again, it's never that simple. These talks happen at the crossroads of politics, military strategy, history, and psychology. Organizations like the United Nations and the European Union often act as mediators. Powerful nations like the United States, Russia, and China frequently step in to facilitate or influence negotiations. They draft agreements, host summits, and apply pressure. Despite all this, peace agreements often fail. And the reasons are as varied as they are complex. At their core, for peace negotiations to succeed, they have to balance three critical elements. First, power. Each side wants to maintain or expand its influence. Second, trust. After decades of conflict, it's hard to believe your opponent will keep their promises. And third, incentives. An agreement must make peace more attractive than continuing the conflict. If any one of these areas fails, the talks usually stall or collapse completely. And we see this pattern of failure across continents and decades. It goes like this. A conflict escalates. Peace talks are announced. Headlines promise progress, negotiations stall, and then the conflict either resumes or becomes frozen. This cycle has repeated itself all over the world. In Afghanistan, peace talks between the Taliban and the government repeatedly fell apart due to mistrust and competing political goals. In Sudan, ceasefires have been undermined by divided leadership and rival regional alliances. In Yemen, diplomatic efforts have been repeatedly derailed by external powers who prioritize their own strategic advantage over humanitarian outcomes. Research points to common structural problems in failed negotiations. First, ambiguity in the agreements. When the terms are vague, each party just interprets them in a way that benefits them. Second, weak enforcement. Without real consequences for breaking the rules, ceasefires and agreements are easily ignored. And third, the exclusion of key players. When negotiations leave out important stakeholders, the peace they create is rarely sustainable. These weaknesses aren't just theoretical, they have devastating human costs every single day. Now, here's a hard truth. In theory, peace negotiations are designed to stop violence, but in practice, they often serve other purposes. Leaders might engage in talks just to buy time to regroup their military, or they might do it to improve their international image without actually giving anything up. Sometimes they use diplomacy to pressure their opponents while secretly continuing the fight. Political incentives can also get in the way. A leader who looks like they're compromising too much risks losing support back home. At the same time, for some local and foreign actors, continued conflict can actually be good for business or for their strategic interests. So, the promise of peace gets tangled up with calculations of power and advantage. The result? Agreements that are fragile, temporary, and frequently broken. Ukraine is a powerful case study of how this all plays out. The conflict started back in 2014 with Russia's annexation of Crimea and the fighting in eastern Ukraine. There were multiple attempts at peace, like the Minsk and two accords, which were supposed to stop the fighting in the Donbas region. Despite some initial optimism, they failed. Observers point to a few key reasons. The terms were ambiguous, leaving lots of room for disputes. There were no credible mechanisms to enforce the agreements. The distrust between the parties was immense, fueled by historical grievances. And external powers were influencing the negotiations in ways that prioritized their own strategic goals over long-term stability. Even in more recent negotiations, the core disputes remain. Control over Donbass and Crimea is a non-negotiable issue for both sides. Ukraine wants security guarantees against future aggression, while Russia demands recognition of its territorial claims. And the involvement of NATO, the EU, and the US, while sometimes helpful, can also complicate a direct resolution. In essence, the negotiation table becomes another battlefield, a place to maneuver for advantage, not a path to peace. And while political elites negotiate, it's civilians who pay the highest price. In Ukraine, millions have been displaced. Families live in constant fear, children grow up surrounded by trauma, and the country's infrastructure is devastated. These human stories are often missing from the headlines, which focus on diplomatic maneuvers. But they are absolutely central to understanding why peace is so elusive. An agreement that ignores the lived experience of the people on the ground is unlikely to last. Research confirms that when peace deals fail to consider social and cultural realities, they often collapse within years, just perpetuating the cycle of violence. And Ukraine is not unique. We see similar patterns all over the globe. In Sudan, multiple ceasefires have failed because different regional powers backed different factions, creating a mess of fragmented authority. In Yemen, external influences and internal divisions have derailed negotiations time and time again. And in Afghanistan, decades of talks collapsed due to exclusion, mistrust, and conflicting priorities. A few common factors explain these failures. There's power asymmetry when one side is much stronger. It's hard to find a fair compromise. There's a lack of enforcement agreements. Without monitors, just fall apart. There's the exclusion of key actors. Ignoring important groups undermines the whole process. And there are cultural misunderstandings. Negotiations that do respect local norms and values are often ignored on the ground. So why does all this matter? The failure of peace talks isn't just a political problem, it has profound human consequences. Millions displaced, generations traumatized, economies shattered, and trust in institutions completely eroded. Diplomacy without enforceable agreements and inclusive structures simply isn't enough. Understanding why peace fails is essential, not just for policymakers but for all of us living in this interconnected world. So far, we've seen how peace talks promise hope, but are often undermined by political strategy, mistrust, and structural weaknesses. Ukraine perfectly illustrates this global pattern of negotiations being used as strategic tools rather than sincere efforts for peace. And the human costs remind us why a real resolution is so urgent. Now, buckle up. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into Ukraine's ongoing negotiations, examine the role of global powers, and then shift our focus to the Middle East. There, the conflict in Gaza and the broader Israel-Palestine issue show us similar patterns. Repeated negotiations, stalled progress, and the unfulfilled promise of peace. Why do peace talks seem to fail every single time? We look at Ukraine, Gaza, and conflicts around the world. And we're left with a pressing question. Why does peace remain so elusive, despite repeated attempts at negotiation? To answer this, we need to look beyond the headlines and dive deep into the structural, political, military, and human dynamics that shape these talks. This is a story about diplomacy getting tangled up with military strategy, painful compromises, and the very real human cost of conflict. Let's start with Ukraine. Peace negotiations there have never been a single, isolated event. Instead, they've been a long series of talks, temporary agreements, and pauses, all while the situation on the ground kept changing. The conflict that really ramped up in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea and the rise of armed groups in the east, led to the first major attempt at diplomacy. The Minsk I Agreement, signed in September 2014. Minsk I was supposed to establish a ceasefire, pull back heavy weapons, and create a foundation for dialogue. But the fighting started again almost immediately, proving that what's written on paper often doesn't survive contact with reality. So, they tried again. Minsk II, signed in February 2015, was a more detailed effort. It called for an immediate ceasefire, the withdrawal of heavy weapons from conflict zones, political reforms to grant special status to certain regions, and steps to restore control over borders. France, Germany, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, were all involved as mediators. Yet, Minsk II also failed to bring lasting peace. Why both sides interpreted the terms differently. Ceasefires were violated over and over again, and there were constant disagreements about the sequence of events should political reforms come before security measures, or the other way around. This created a stalemate that nobody could break. The problems with Minsk II weren't just about procedure. Analysts point to several deeper issues. First, the language in the agreement was ambiguous. It left so much room for interpretation that each side could frame its obligations in its own way. This just led to a cycle of accusations and counter-accusations. Second, there were no real enforcement mechanisms. The OSCE observers were on the ground to monitor the agreement, but they didn't have the authority or the access to do much when violations happened. So, most violations went unaddressed. Third, the geopolitical dynamics were complex. The agreement treated the situation mostly as an internal matter, but it didn't fully account for the influence of external supporters or their strategic interests. And finally, there was a power imbalance on the ground. External support for armed groups kept the conflict going and gave one side more leverage in the negotiations. Ultimately, Minsk II just froze the conflict for a while. It didn't solve any of the root causes. Between 2015 and early 2022, Ukraine saw a non-stop fighting and sporadic diplomatic talks. Tensions sometimes eased, but no permanent settlement ever emerged. Then, in February 2022, the full-scale escalation happened, and all the previous frameworks were basically thrown out the window. New negotiations began in neutral locations. They explored big ideas like territorial compromises, Ukraine adopting a neutral status, and international security guarantees. One proposal, often called the Istanbul Framework, suggested Ukraine could remain neutral and not join certain alliances. In return, it would get security assurances from international partners and temporary arrangements for contested territories. But even with some progress, these talks fell apart without a final agreement. So, why did the 2022 negotiations collapse? Several key factors were at play. The territorial and security demands from both sides were simply incompatible. Neither was willing to make the huge concessions needed to find a middle ground. Some major international players were also less involved or aligned, which made it harder for any proposed framework to gain universal acceptance. And, critically, there were the military factors. Both sides believed they could still gain more on the battlefield, which seriously reduced their incentive to compromise at the negotiating table. Even the most promising drafts failed to produce a lasting ceasefire, showing just how deeply negotiations are tied to military strategy and perception. Fast forward to late 2025, diplomacy reached another critical point. High-profile meetings involving Ukraine, the United States, and other international actors produced new draft agreements that were reportedly close to being finalized. It was said that about 95% of a proposed plan was agreed upon. This included tentative ideas for temporary arrangements in contested areas, potential demilitarized zones, and even mechanisms for public confirmation. But that last 5% is always the hardest. Key issues remained unresolved, especially territorial disputes, security guarantees, and the political future of regions with complex demographics. Different priorities and approaches among the key players prevented the deal from being finalized. So why do these agreements repeatedly stall, even when it feels like they're almost there? Let's break down the strategic obstacles. First, there's the clash between territorial integrity and practical compromises. Ukraine has constitutional commitments to its entire territory, but peace agreements often require temporary arrangements that can feel like giving up land, even if it's not meant to be permanent. Second, there's the tension between security assurances and neutrality. Any proposal for security guarantees has to be reconciled with demands for neutrality or non-alignment. How can a country be neutral but also have powerful allies guaranteeing its safety? It's a paradox. Finally, the global stakeholders, the mediators, and international powers all have their own strategic calculations that influence the terms and the timing of any deal. And this brings us to the constant interplay between diplomacy and military reality. Peace negotiations don't happen in a vacuum. A discussion about a ceasefire can also be a strategic pause, giving one side time to reposition its forces, rebuild its supplies, or apply more pressure. Political and military strategies often run in parallel. A country's position at the negotiating table is directly influenced by its perceived advantages or threats on the ground. This creates an incredibly complex environment where talks can move forward, only to stall again if one side believes it can achieve its goals through military means instead. While diplomats and generals play this high-stakes game, we can't forget the human dimension. Millions of people have been displaced, forced to leave their homes, and move either within Ukraine or to other countries. The war has caused devastating economic hardship, destroying infrastructure, local economies, and entire communities. And then there's the psychological toll. The constant uncertainty and exposure to violence leave deep, lasting emotional and social scars. Any durable peace agreement has to address not just the political disputes, but also the long road to human recovery and security. This is a factor that's often tragically underestimated in high-level negotiations. So, why does failure persist? It comes down to a few core problems. Persistent territorial disputes that are seen as existential by both sides. Divergent security priorities that are incredibly difficult to align. Political incentives that are often misaligned with compromise. The strategic use of negotiations as just another tool of leverage, and the complex web of global dynamics where everyone has a stake, these challenges often turn ceasefires and draft agreements into temporary solutions rather than permanent resolutions. The experience in Ukraine offers some powerful lessons for any future peace process around the world. First, credible and robust security assurances are absolutely central to any lasting peace. Vague promises won't work. Second, successful agreements must include social, economic, and human considerations. Rebuilding lives is just as important as redrawing lines on a map. Third, international mediation requires consistency, coordination, and impartiality to be effective. And finally, we can never ignore the fact that realities on the ground and military conditions will always shape what is possible at the negotiating table. These lessons are universal, and as we look at other conflicts, we see the same patterns emerging. In our next segment, we'll explore the history of peace negotiations in the Middle East, focusing on Gaza and the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict there too. Agreements have been repeatedly attempted, but lasting peace has proven just as elusive. Just like in Ukraine, the complex interplay of territory, identity, history, and international involvement shapes the entire diplomatic landscape. Stay with us as we continue to uncover the persistent challenges of global peace, negotiations, and why. Despite so much hope and effort, peace talks so often fail to deliver the lasting resolutions the world desperately needs. After exploring why peace talks in Ukraine have repeatedly stalled, we now turn to another deeply entrenched conflict, the Israel-Palestine peace process. Here too, peace has been promised and negotiated countless times, yet it remains elusive. To understand why, we must look beyond the negotiations themselves and examine the history, the core disputes, and the political realities that have undermined every attempt at peace. The modern peace process began in the early 1990s with the Oslo Accords. On the surface, it was a historic breakthrough. The Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, and the State of Israel recognized each other, and formal talks began. But today, more than 30 years later, the accords are widely seen as a failure. Why? The answer lies in what they did and what they didn't do. Oslo was designed as an interim agreement meant to build confidence and lead to a final settlement, but it left the biggest, most existential issues unresolved: territory, borders, the status of Jerusalem, refugees, and ultimate sovereignty. Without a clear framework for these core problems, later negotiations struggled to gain any real traction. Another major flaw from the start was the power imbalance. Israel, a strong sovereign state, negotiated from a position of dominance. The Palestinian Authority, on the other hand, lacked comparable resources, political unity, and autonomy. This asymmetry meant that even when agreements were reached, they often failed to produce equitable outcomes on the ground. The Oslo process was born from hope. Its architects saw it as a stepping stone to peace, but reality quickly diverged from that vision. During the Oslo years, Israeli settlements in the West Bank continued to expand rapidly. This expansion fundamentally undermined the possibility of a viable, contiguous Palestinian state. As settler communities and infrastructure grew, the geography on the ground shifted, making it even harder to negotiate territory and borders. At the same time, the Palestinian Authority struggled to establish effective control, economic stability, and political legitimacy. Hopes for economic prosperity tied to the peace process faded, and aspirations for true self-determination waned. The power imbalance also affected the negotiations themselves. Israel negotiated with the PLO, but militant groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad were left out. They remained a key part of Palestinian resistance, especially in Gaza, where Hamas would later take control. This division made it incredibly difficult for Palestinians to present a unified front. Numerous attempts at peace followed Oslo, including the Camp David Summit in 2000, the Wye River Memorandum, and the Roadmap for Peace. At times, negotiators seemed close to a breakthrough, but each time, the same core issues remained unresolved. At Camp David in 2000, questions about borders, security, Jerusalem, and refugees were still on the table. The summit ended without an agreement, and just months later, the Second Intifada erupted, a violent uprising that deepened mistrust and set back diplomatic progress for years. Efforts that followed repeatedly hit the same walls, while peace efforts with the broader Palestinian leadership faced constant challenges. The conflict between Israel and Gaza, particularly with Hamas, has been even more resistant to diplomacy. Hamas, which has governed Gaza since 2007, has fundamentally different objectives. While many negotiations centered on a two-state solution, Hamas has often rejected key parts of that model, insisting on resistance to what it views as occupation. This divergence makes negotiated settlements extremely difficult. Recent efforts for ceasefires have also repeatedly stalled. Deals for hostage releases and humanitarian aid have been obstructed by disagreements over troop withdrawal, the role of armed groups, and security conditions. The dynamic in Gaza illustrates a broader pattern. When the core objectives of the parties are directly opposed, agreements struggle to last. Israel's insistence on dismantling armed groups for its security clashes with Hamas's refusal to disarm. One of the most persistent obstacles in any ceasefire negotiation is the question of military presence. Israeli officials often insist on maintaining troops in key areas of Gaza, arguing it's necessary to protect civilians and prevent militants from regrouping. Critics, however, say this prevents any real sovereignty for Gaza and jeopardizes long-term peace. It's a classic standoff. One side prioritizes maximum security and control, while the other prioritizes freedom from occupation. This makes it nearly impossible to find terms both can accept. Beyond the immediate issues of troops and hostages, the peace process faces massive structural obstacles. First, territory and borders. The simple question of who controls what land has kept negotiations in a loop for decades. Without a shared framework, peace remains just an idea. Second, Jerusalem. The city holds deep religious and historical significance for both Jews and Palestinians. Disagreement over its status, especially East Jerusalem, has derailed talks time and time again. Third, refugees. The fate of Palestinian refugees and the question of their right to return is one of the most emotionally charged and unresolved issues. And finally, beyond all the maps and strategies, lies a deep human issue: mistrust. Decades of violence, displacement, and historical grievance have created wounds that are hard to heal. For many Palestinians, the experience of occupation and settlement expansion creates a profound sense of injustice. For many Israelis, ongoing security threats reinforce a worldview where compromise feels like an existential risk. These powerful narratives of fear and survival have immense influence over any negotiation. When we compare the peace processes in Ukraine and Israel-Palestine, a striking pattern emerges. In both cases, core issues are often set aside in favor of temporary fixes. Tensions between one side's demand for security and the other's demand for autonomy shrink the space for negotiation. Power imbalances skew the outcomes, and external mediators, while helpful, often have their own strategic interests at play. This shows us that peace isn't just about talks. It's about transforming relationships and addressing root causes. So, what would real peace require? First, inclusive negotiations that bring all relevant parties to the table. Second, clear, mutually agreed-upon roadmaps for tackling the toughest issues. Third, power-balanced mechanisms to ensure everyone holds up their end of the deal. And fourth, societal reconciliation efforts that go beyond just political agreements. As we conclude this journey, some important questions remain. Not to assign blame, but to encourage deeper understanding. Can peace ever be sustainable without addressing both security needs and political aspirations at the same time? How can we redesign negotiations to empower all parties fairly? And is it possible to build trust after decades of trauma? These questions are essential because they push us to think about real solutions, not just narratives of defeat. They invite us to consider the complex human and political realities, and to imagine what peace might truly require in the 21st century. Thank you for watching. If this video made you think, please consider liking and subscribing for more deep dives into the world's most complex issues.